Seems like... Oh, no, it's the EU settlement scheme. No, I don't know. Let's try not to get you, Nick, though. That's the...
No, yes. I don't think I can attend these kind of things. Better not to. Yes. I don't know how to sound. I got a little bit excited at some points and I was leaning in.
I think you'll be all right. You can just do an EQ on it.
Yes. Just like relax, man, relax.
That's good. Yeah, you look good.
Great.
I think here's, it's more.
Starting broadcast recording. A10 recording. Just so we can get everything sorted.
Yeah, all good?
Yep, perfect.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
5 seconds after I leave.
Yeah, we'll leave it. Okay, so from the top, episode 2, how it started. Picture the scene. It's August 2016. The UK has just voted for Brexit. Across the Atlantic, reality TV star Donald Trump is trailing the Democratic favourite Hillary Clinton in the US presidential election. And in London, hundreds of riders are on strike. And in London, hundreds of riders are on strike for the first time, fighting against a change in pay structure which will see them shifted from an hourly rate to a pure per-drop piece rate. So a couple of clips in there. And then we have the series music as the starter. Welcome to Beating the Platforms, Welcome to Beating the Platforms, a 4-part podcast by Notes from Below about class struggle in platform capitalism. I'm Callum Cant, an ex-rider and editor of Notes from Below.
And I'm Ulysses, a delivery worker and organizer. In this episode, we are going to go over the recent history of delivery workers' struggles in Britain. We are going to be covering a lot of ground. So if you want more details on any of the things we are talking about, make sure you check the show notes for links to further reading. But first, let's finish the stories of the 2016 strikes. Within a week of delivery strikes, the action had spread and Uber Eats riders joined in.
Yeah, I think we need to rewrite that because it doesn't follow if you've gone from one to the other. So let me super quickly rewrite that.
Mm-hmm.
No, actually, it's okay. No, it's okay. It's okay. No, you did it, and you did a good take, didn't you? So we've got the Channel 4 clip, and then it's me after that. It's hard to imagine now just how surprising these strikes were. But for outside observers, this really did look like a miracle. The dominant assumption was that platform workers couldn't organise because the app made them totally isolated. Factor in a wider context of historically low levels of strike action, and you have a situation in which this strike stuck out like a beacon of hope. What was even more remarkable was that they won a limited victory. Deliveroo allowed anyone who wanted to stay on the old hourly wage to do so, and only applied the piece rate to new riders.
Despite the assumption that platforms workers were isolated from each other, the reality was very different. Riders are always meeting each other. We bump into each other on the streets and in restaurants every day, like we discussed last episode. These connections become the bonds of solidarity, we rely on when we organize strike action. So before the London strikes, groups of workers have been meeting in different places. Some went to rave together, some play together. Some went to raves together, some pray together, some play football together. They had WhatsApp groups and they knew each other well. At that time, there were a lot fewer riders in the city. So the community had a different vibe. The strike wasn't the first these networks had taken action. A few weeks earlier, Deliveroo had assisted the UK border agency in conducting an immigration raid on their own staff at the company's London office. Riders were very angry. Days later, the same thing happened at a restaurant called Byron Burgers. Again, with the bosses collaborating with the border agency. 20 workers were detained and then deported. Riders Riders respond by boycotting any deliveries from Byron. This was the start of the process of organizing that would lead to the summer strikes.
Jamie Woodcock is another editor of Notes from Below, and when the strikes kicked off in London back in 2016, he went down to see what was going on. Okay, so then we'll have the interview with him there. And then there's a section of you after the Latin bit at the end.
The strike was the start of the first round of the riders' strikes in the history of the gig economy. This strike was the first of the first round of this strike was the start of the first round of riders' strikes in the history of the gig economy. In this episode of Beating the Platforms, we are going to explore that history in some more depth. Our goal is to show you where the struggle has been before. Our goal is to show you where the struggle has been before, so we can understand where we should go next. We can break the recent history of strikes up in three parts. First, the strikes between 2016 and 2020, then the pandemic years and the
lull.
Then the pandemic years and the low. Then the pandemic years and the low that followed 2020-2023, and then to the latest cycle of strikes early in 2024. So let's get started with the first part.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about London in 2016. Delivery workers start striking over a change in the pay structure, and it spreads to Uber Eats. It's kind of a miracle. Everyone's very surprised. At the time, I was working a desk job, and I saw all these videos on Facebook of striking couriers. And I was really shocked by how surprised we all were, how none of us knew how it had happened, and how lots of people who were very, very interested in worker organising and in technology and other things hadn't had any connection to this workers in advance. So I kind of had a load of unanswered questions that I wanted to understand, like how had this happened, and what did it really mean? So I got a job at Deliveroo in part because I wanted to answer those questions. I wanted to see how these miraculous strikes had emerged out of nothing, and thought that getting a job would be the easiest way to go straight into the heart of the question and find out.
And what happened next?
Okay, so when I started the job, this was back in 2016, 2017, we were making all right money. So you could do 3 deliveries an hour without too much of a problem. So you could do £12 an hour, working on a bike, a cycle, pedal bike. And gradually, over time, they started to hire more and more people. So Brighton's a student city. Loads of people were coming. It was about September to start their new year at the university. And they were basically all coming and getting jobs as delivery riders. So for them, this was a free login zone. We just got paid per delivery. It meant that they still had to pay the exact same amount for each delivery. Every delivery was £4, but they had more people to do it, so the waiting time was less. So it increased their quality of service. It increased how quickly they could get riders to places. But for us, it meant that there was a drop in the number of orders available. So you went from working drop to drop, where you would finish one delivery, go straight to the next one for 4 or 5 hours in the evenings, to doing a delivery and then waiting for ages, right? So you'd do one delivery and then have a half hour sitting down, waiting for the next one to come through, bang, do that one, half hour, wait again. So suddenly you went from making £12 an hour to £8 or £4 an hour, right? And that was a massive transition for everyone. And at the time, we were all told by the app to meet in the same place, which is the zone centre in the centre of town, where we would go and sit down and chat about work. And the first question basically you always asked was, oh, how's work going? How busy are you? You know, what kind of wages are you making? And we all realised together collectively through this kind of constant reflective comparison that we were making much less money than we used to. And that got people really angry. Right? And so then naturally, because you're sat around for half an hour with nothing to do in the cold, you start talking about what we could do. And I didn't push the idea of strikes. They just organically came out. So I was involved in kind of an organising process where we were saying, okay, we're all interested in doing this. How do we do it? What should we do? How should we, move from an abstract idea to concrete practice? So I thought I had a bit of an idea in my head of like how trade union organising worked. I'd been around strikes before, and I'd been kind of a militant for 5 years or something at that point. So I started recruiting people to come to a meeting, and we're like, oh, we're all going to have a meeting, and we're going to get a union down, and we'll talk to the union about joining, and then it will be a very slow process from there, and gradually, eventually, we'll get to the point of going on strike. So we call this meeting. At the time, like the start of that evening, I was like, look, I'd be happy if 5 people show up, you know, because I didn't have big hopes. I didn't know how successful we were being in talking to everyone. I didn't know, lots of people had said they're interested, but people say they're interested in lots of things and then don't follow through on it. But then I opened the door and some people were already there. Like it was meant to be a 6 o'clock meeting and there were a few people already there. And by the time everyone filed in, we had about 20 riders there. There was someone from the IWGB, the union that had been very involved in London, come down to talk to us about career organising, and we all decided that, yeah, we were going to join. So 6 of us got elected as kind of reps to lead the organising effort, and we signed up as members. Then the idea that we had as reps was, okay, we're going to have this like long campaign, we're going to build from very small start and like gradually build. What actually happened was a group of Brazilian workers heard that there was now a union and they went, okay, there's a union, that means we can go on strike. So they then like in the WhatsApp groups like, okay, so we've decided to go on strike next week. And we're like, what? Jesus Christ. Okay. And we kind of had to react. The problem for me was I wasn't in town. I had to be away seeing my family. So I missed the first strike. But what we saw kind of over WhatsApp, I got all these videos of, you know, 100 workers in our zone centre. There's not that many people, probably 200 worked in Brighton fully. So like everyone was out and not working. In the kitchens, like all the orders were piling up. Like they were just making and remaking the same order and over and over and over again. But no one was coming to deliver it. So it caused complete chaos, shut down the app for the whole evening. They actually turned it off so you couldn't order at all in Brighton because they knew there was no chance of them getting the food to you. And that was like a really strong first demonstration of this dynamic where people are very ready to mobilise and very ready to act really quickly. But before long, we fell into what increasingly becomes obviously the real challenge here, which is how do you turn that very rapid-fire organisation into something more durable and something more long-term? Because that first strike was followed by a period of us having less engagement, less action. We called these like demonstrations where members of the public and us would ride around town together, and they were still drawing decent numbers, but the strikes didn't come back at a higher level. So we'd gone from nothing to a really big strike and then trying to build a longer organisation and facing all sorts of challenges really quickly. But as I was doing all of that, I set up this bulletin, right? So the idea was it was an A4 piece of paper that basically was printed both sides and that shared stories from different places, and it had an introduction in a number of different languages. It had like a Portuguese one, a Bangla one, and a few others. And the goal of this piece of paper was to circulate ideas and around places so that riders from one city could talk to another city and you could like hand it out at the zone centre. So we were doing this bulletin and handing it out. It was called the Rebel Roo, and it was putting me in connection increasingly with like riders in Leeds, riders in Marseille, riders all over the place. People would email in and be like, can I have copies to hand out in my place? And the more we were talking, the more we realised that there were basically like the same thing was happening over and over all over the place. So none of this was being captured though officially by the data, so you couldn't find out what was going on by like asking the Office for National Statistics how many delivery strikes there been. In part because we were all self-employed, so technically it wasn't like legally in the UK strike action. It was just considered, you know, some weird subcategory of like self-organised workers deciding not to work that day. So that gave us kind of a measurement challenge and like an understanding challenge where we couldn't see what was happening. There were a few WhatsApp groups that were made up of loads of people from all over Europe. So I basically did a little project where I said, okay, let's all report what's happened in our places since 2016 so that we can get an understanding of the big picture. So that was riders from 7 different countries: UK, France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Spain. And we wanted to get people to kind of write in and basically say what had happened. And the results were really interesting because what we saw was between 2016 and 2017, there was a clear upwards trend in strike action with kind of 3 peaks, basically summer 2016, spring 2017, and winter 2017. And each of these peaks have been bigger in terms of the number of events and the number of participants, and they'd actually grown more synchronized over time. So it was all kicking off in all these different cities at the same time repeatedly. And to give you an idea, I mean, we're talking about like London, Turin, Leeds, Brighton, Marseille, Paris, Berlin, Barcelona, Valencia, Madrid, Bordeaux, Lyon, Amsterdam, Bologna. This was huge, right? And none of us had really realized that the wave was quite so big. But this was how the gig economy was born, in a flurry of strikes and protests, with workers immediately attempting to defend themselves against bosses who seemed set on fucking them over.
I got a doubt, right? Do you think that at the beginning, 2016,
Yeah.
it was easier for you guys to organize yourselves because the demographic was different? Let's say was the workers were mainly students or British, while right now was mainly immigrants.
Yeah.
So you said that when the union approached uh, the writers, there were like people joining the union straight away, which is something that's not happening right now because there's this anti-union thinking from, especially from the Brazilian community.
Yeah.
Do you think this was something that make your life easier to organize?
Yeah, so there were two differences, I think, majorly now that were different. So the first was that we had one zone centre, that we all went to the same place. So like all the mopeds went to one place, all the bike riders went to the other place, right? And that meant that like rather than waiting in little groups, everyone in the zone would go to the same spot. So sometimes you'd have like 50 plus riders all sitting there. So that naturally became like a massive meeting.
Yes.
Because rather than like, I'm going to wait at this McDonald's, I'm going to wait at this McDonald's, and like everyone's spread out, everyone was being very concentrated, which made it super easy. And there was these giant open air meetings. And as you said, there were more different demographics involved. So particularly with the cyclists, which was who I was organising with primarily, like, yeah, a lot of us were white, British, young people, not all students, like a lot of people who were like musicians who needed money to make their gig. There was one bloke I remember who was his choice was basically be on Job Seekers, which was the benefit at the time, or ride for Deliveroo, and he made more money working for Deliveroo, so he decided to do that. Yeah, musicians, 17, 18-year-olds, like all this kind of stuff. And that, we had like a certain cultural language that often involved, like we might have been on some protests in our time, and we kind of, our feelings about trade unions tended to be a bit more positive, and like, yeah, we could organise with each other really easy. But there were always migrant moped riders doing 80 plus hours a week. That's always been a feature. And they've always been the ones who've done the bulk of the volume, because like students are unpredictable. They'll work sometimes. You get tired if you're working on a bike and you work 4 or 5 hours, especially like somewhere like Brighton that's really hilly. You're exhausted at the end of it, so you just can't do the number of hours. I mean, if you're like a proper cycle courier, you can, but for most people, it's really difficult. So basically, like there were these two sides of the workforce, and when we were organised and when we were going on strike, there was a coalition built between the two. So you'd have, like Egyptian riders and Brazilian riders and people like me, like young white British guys, all working together. But over time, I think one of the really clear trends we're going to see through this history is that there's been a determined shift, I think deliberately by the platforms, to increase the amount of work that's done by this migrant moped workforce, who are willing to accept lower wages sometimes, and a massive reduction in the number of people who are working on bikes. And that, all the advertising, it's worth saying, of what a delivery rider was like, was it was a young white British student, right? That's every bit of advertising, that's what it looked like. And that's what they were constantly trying to portray. They're like, oh, this is a workforce who are just doing a couple of hours around their studies or whatever. But that's just not the reality anymore. And that's shifted through the course of this history. But the backbone of these strikes, every single one we've looked at, has always been the migrant moped riders. They were always the most militant, always the most organised, but not necessarily the easiest to organise into a union, right? And that's one of the tensions that has been really difficult to navigate.
Also, you said about the bulletins that you start by then, like, and the internet was not a big thing at that time.
The internet was 2017, like
Was it?
Yeah, I mean the internet was, so like we still had WhatsApp groups, so you'd get like the link and you'd like send it into all of the WhatsApp groups, and then it would get forwarded between them.
So let's say again. So you said about the bulletins, yes, but you didn't have much of these new social media platforms like TikTok and Reels where things spread and go viral. So we're using bulletins. I see pretty much as like something from the punk movement, fanzines. That's how you did, right?
Yeah, I mean, so we had the WhatsApp groups and we sent the link to these bulletins between the WhatsApp groups, and it had like an email address. But you're totally right. Like there was no, going live on Instagram and during a strike and these things being sent around, or like very short form video wasn't a thing. Like the big social media platforms, Instagram was just photos. Twitter was like, as it is now, a very sub-selection of people. And Facebook wasn't that open. So it was like you couldn't share things quite as widely. So yeah, it was a very different period in how things could spread and go viral. So maybe there was less of this interconnection that we've talked about before between like Brazil and the UK. It was perhaps more like, in specific places there would be. So I remember there was a Brighton Brighton Deliveroo Facebook group that people would post stuff in, but then there wasn't like a lot of the people in Brighton didn't know anyone in London. You know, there wasn't these back and forth connections. So maybe that's more open now, and that's an opportunity, right?
That's great.
Okay, let's go on to Uber Eats 2018. You got that section?
So the pattern you just described of wage cuts leading to bigger and bigger rounds of strike actions continued in the UK too. In 2018, Uber Eats workers were on strike over a 40% fall in the value of minimum fee per delivery. Once again, wages were the main motivation.
Young Callum shouting at Road Junction.
Yes.
So yeah,
I
as
got
young me was being very excited at Aldgate East there, Uber Eats strikes were also kicking off in Cardiff, Plymouth and Glasgow. So this attempt to cut wages was in the run-up to the Uber IPO. So that's when shares get sold in the public market for the first time and the valuation of a company is established. So Uber CEO at the time, Uber CEO at the time, Dara Korozwowski, was increasing focus on Uber Eats as a core part of the Uber business model. At the time, Uber were also rumoured to be about to buy Deliveroo's European operations, meaning that it seemed like a massive monopoly might be in the process of being formed. So Uber were basically trying to turn the screw on riders to increase Uber Eats' productivity So Uber were basically trying to turn the screw on riders to increase Uber Eats' profitability, to prove to investors that this was a long-term viable model, that they should put their money in, and that the IPO should value Uber really highly. So you can kind of see here how the business model of these platforms work. So labor costs are always the number one expense. Making profit relies on a two-part strategy of capturing as much market as possible, of becoming this monopoly, and of driving down those costs. Because you can't increase productivity that much. If you take an example of like, it's like a really famous industrial process like car manufacture, right? When Ford really grew and dominated the car market in the US in the 1910s, what they were doing was they were massively increasing productivity by introducing the assembly line as a new technology, right? So over that period, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of % increases in productivity in car manufacture. So the product becomes much cheaper, and that allows you to dominate more of the market and sell more. So you can produce, or you can dominate more of the market and become a bigger player by doing that, and you can kind of prove your viability to investors as a more profitable part of capital. But you can't do the same thing in delivery, right? The productivity of the labor process can't really be improved that much. You know, it's always going to take a certain amount of time to drive a moped from A to B. You can't improve that by 100%. You can't double the speed of the moped, right? So this means that the only way to get more value out of the same process is take more commission off the restaurant, or on the other hand, pay the rider less. And it's really clear that the strategy they're taking is kind of a combination of these, right? Like pay less and less commission where possible to restaurants, so that Deliveroo as a middle player is taking a bigger slice of the money, and then also crack down on the amount that they're paying out to the riders so that they're getting a bigger slice. So profit maximization in this particular sector is always going to lead to wage struggle, right? And it's kind of a zero sum, where there's a certain amount of money from each order that's going to be divided at some level into wages and profits, right? The capitalist is going to get part of it and the workers are going to get part of it. The thing that determines who gets what is the balance of power between the two of them. The more powerful workers are, the more they can defend a higher wage. The less powerful they are, the more the platform boss is going to take the piss and drive wages down.
I just want to give an example. When we were doing the second strike, we had
And this is in 2024.
yes, and we had a lot of support from small restaurant operators and owners. And I remember one of them saying, like, you guys really need to fight these companies because they are draining us. You know, Deliveroo just raised our fees from 17% to nearly 30%. So he was saying, oh, look, we have a small fish and chip shop here, and there's not much fish that you can sell in a day, right?
Yeah.
So if I make £1,000, I had to pay my staff costs, business insurance, and plus give 30% to Deliveroo just by being the middleman. So he said, like, I don't know, maybe in a near time, if this carries on, I would better just sell the business and get a job.
Yeah.
This was a family man who's been running a business for years, you know. He's part of the community. People like to go there and chat with him. And I was thinking, look, these companies are not just screwing us. They're going against everyone.
Yeah, so they're like predatory on not just the riders, but also on small business owners who are connected in, right?
Yes.
And this is kind of classic for capital. It eats that. So that guy would be part of the petty bourgeoisie, right? So this like small class of owners who might employ a few people. They're not big business. They're not big capital. They might not make a huge amount of money, but they're trying to like fit the model. But that class always gets kind of eliminated whenever there's a crisis. It just gets crunched because they're not big enough to fight the big companies, and the big companies will take their business whenever they can. So yeah, it's not a surprising trend when they're using this kind of monopoly position to take value off both parts. It's completely predictable in some ways.
And I think this is something that would lead to the subject that we'll be talking about, dark kitchens, because I truly believe that what they're trying to do is increasing the fees from these restaurants, try to push them for future dark kitchens in the area and say, look, you can just rent one of these rooms here and trade from that, right? Reduce your costs and work with us.
Yeah.
And I see these, they would try to push as much as they can this subscription model where you pay a monthly fee and then you get as much deliveries as you can, you know?
Well, let's talk about dark kitchens. What is a dark kitchen?
Well, dark kitchen is something that it's supposed to be good, but it's not really, right? Because dark kitchen starts, I believe, in the beginning of the pandemic, or
a bit earlier than that. So there was one in Brighton in 2017, but it's like a tiny idea at that time. It's like a very slight germ, and they start out with these little kitchens that have no public storefront. That's why they're called dark. You can't rent, or you can't go and sit down and have a meal there, but the owners rent them in order to just do deliveries. So they were called additions at the time. They are still sometimes called additions. So there'd be like a rotating cast of restaurants that would do all of their orders out of there. And these would sometimes be on special offer, and Deliveroo would charge them both rent and sometimes higher commission as well, so it made more money for them. And that these basically were intended to be their way of expanding out into food production. So when they were talking to investors at the time, Deliveroo were saying, like, our long-term plan is we're going to have these dark kitchens everywhere, and we're going to automate food production and food delivery. So we're going to have like automated robot chefs making the pizzas, and then we're going to have automated delivery drones doing the orders. And we're going to expand from being like a delivery company that works with existing restaurants to running our own offering and using all the data we've gathered over the years to create these like automatic kitchens that produce exactly what people want, exactly when they want it, with no waste and no human labor costs and all the rest of it. Now, to a degree, that was always a fantasy. It was a fantasy way of like getting investors to give them money, and they never really intended, I don't think, on following it through. But you can see the pitch deck. I mean, it is really what they were selling, and people were giving them money, venture capitalists, all that lot, were giving them money on this basis. But it's really about expanding from just delivery to also being a kind of a landlord as well, right? And that expansion then allows them to take in more value. So they get into the commercial property market where they're doing restaurant property. And they've now, I mean, they might not officially have given up on this idea of automatic food production and delivery, but there's no evidence of that future coming any closer. Instead, they've opened loads of these dark kitchens. There's one very near where I live, right, in southeast London. And basically it has, I think, 7 or 8 restaurants operating out of the same thing. And the people in these kitchens are just producing very quickly, all night long, things that go down to one central point, and then the delivery riders come in and picking up all night long, right? And that means that restaurants that might have, in terms of real estate, only a limited central London presence can then serve a much bigger market. And this one is on the verge of it's not that far from Dulwich, so it allows them to then sell a lot of this quite expensive food into lots of fancy people. So it gives them a way to expand their market and do more stuff. And for Deliveroo, it's kind of this commercial property point. But this also concentrates loads of riders and orders in one place, right? Which can be an opportunity for organisers.
Yes, definitely, yes. I would say the latest waves of strikes organized by Delivery Job UK starts at Battersea Kitchen dishes, right? So there were a number of riders that were not really happy with the way the things were going. And then they start organizing small strikes. At first, there were 6 areas where they were going to strike, but because people were so angry, the thing just grew exponentially. And I would say in a matter of 2-3 days, we had full WhatsApp groups with 2,000 people, and these always start from these dark kitchens.
Yeah, because they act a bit like the zone centres used to, right? Like they're the meeting points where everyone's coming together and everyone waits for their orders. So they might have abolished the idea that you have to go somewhere and wait in between orders during the time you're logged onto the app, but they haven't actually eliminated the fact that workers keep on meeting each other, and when they do, they kind of spontaneously end up organising. There's no like supervision there. There's no management that keeps a lid on that. So there's always this opportunity.
Also, one thing that I would say about dark kitchen is that if dark kitchens were used for small food operators, people who, like, my aunt makes a really nice cake, I would love to sell it. That I think that's dark kitchens would be perfect for these people. Instead of renting a kitchen, they have a place and they have a platform to sell. But this is not what we see on Deliveroo. We just see that they are selling like established companies,
Yeah.
and pushing like the small restaurants to the bottom. You had to spend more and more money on marketing on these platforms just for you to be seen.
Yeah, you have to have your thing sponsored, and yeah.
Yes, I remember one guy who sells sushi close to my house. He was saying that his accountant just called him and said, like, "Do you know that you paid Deliveroo last year 20,000 pounds?" And he was, bloody hell, man! I couldn't open another restaurant with that money.
Yeah.
I said, yes, and that's you have no option where to spend your money on marketing.
Yeah.
It's not that you really can dictate, say, well, this year our budget is that. No, they dictate that to you.
And if you're interested in dark kitchens, we have an account in Notes from Below, issue 20, I think, that we'll link in the show notes, from a worker who worked as a chef in one of these, describing what the labour process is like and how repetitive and de-skilled and kind of like high turnover it is. Which is super interesting. But to go back to our main story, so we've talked about these Uber strikes kicking off ahead of the independent public offering, the IPO, where the shares were going to be sold for the first time. But they didn't just kick off once. They kept on growing and growing and growing. And they were also, for the first time, connected to much wider workforces. So a lot of these strikes were focused on Uber Eats, but Uber taxi workers, the people doing the ride sharing, were also on strike a lot at this time. So at one point, Uber have a HQ in a giant tower at Aldgate East in East London. And at one point, either Uber Eats riders or Uber taxi riders had been outside 4 times in a month, right? And they were storming the lobby. They were outside having these large protests. We heard the audio clip earlier of what it sounded like out there. So Uber workers were really organised. And then also increasingly hospitality workers were organised. And this is where we saw like a really interesting crossover in 2018. Hospitality as an industry is the least organised in the UK, right? At the time, it was about 2.9% union density. Very, very few union members. So that means, for every 100, you're going to have barely 3 people in a union. But there were strikes going on in Wetherspoons, the pub chain, TGI Fridays, the restaurant chain, and these workers, and McDonald's as well. And these workers were kind of teaming up with the delivery workers, because the delivery workers said, okay, you've got a strike coming up in a couple of weeks. We're going to time our first national delivery strike to happen at exactly the same time. So we're all kind of coming together. So particularly with McDonald's, like McDonald's at the time did a huge proportion of Uber Eats deliveries and still does. So these workers, like potentially on 2 sides of the same, like the person who prepares the food and the person who delivers it, could have been on strike at the same moment. So that was a really interesting and exciting connection. They were all fighting over wages as well, which gave it kind of a political element as well, where they were all saying, we're not being paid enough, our real wages are too low. So that coalescence of struggles was, I think, a really interesting example of how these things can grow. And it was also, as we said, the first time that there had been a national organised strike. So it's the first time we've gone from like Leeds, Brighton, Bristol, London, whatever, striking on their own, to everyone trying to strike at the same time. This was largely facilitated by, at the time, a union called the IWW. It's a couriers network, which was like the bigger umbrella organisation for all these groups. And it was really effective. The challenge was, and it has always been with all of these, that these constant, sporadic, short bursts of action that kind of come and go lead to sometimes short-term concessions. So there might be a boost, for example. So all Uber deliveries get multiplied by a certain amount, right? So either 1.0, so no boost, or up to 1.5, 1.6, 1.7. And for short times after these strikes, there would be significant boost increases. At least, 0.1, 0.2, which is a 10-20% wage increase for short periods of time in the zones where they'd happened. But those gains weren't collectively negotiated. It was like, we'll go on strike, we'll fuck shit up, and then it will kind of have an impact, and we'll rely the bosses will eventually like realize that we're really annoyed and give us something. But there was no collectively bargained or negotiated agreement that meant that 10 or 20% pay rise couldn't be rolled back in a month's time. So you'd see all these like short-term victories where there would be a pay rise for a bit, and then it would just disappear straight away. So that really was like the major challenge of this period, where these unions organizations weren't building. Instead, we were just getting like very short and sharp explosions, followed by concessions, but then nothing long term. Okay. So then, even if we fast forward a year after the fast food shutdown, after workers in McDonald's and Uber Eats and all the rest were on strike at the same time, there's still a crazy amount of stuff going on. So there were strikes in Reading, Brentwood, Newcastle, Colchester, Oxford, Nottingham, Bristol, Brixton, Clapham, Balham, Plymouth, Exeter, Bermondsey, Peckham, Camberwell, Brentwood and Croydon. And that is just in September 2019. So everywhere across the country, people are striking. The IWGB, which is again the union that is kind of coming to the fore now, is reporting a membership increase of about 25%. But those strikes continue to be self-organized often with no connections. So sometimes they're literally happening in like one McDonald's. Like all the Uber Eats workers in one McDonald's are going on strike, and they might not ever communicate that to anyone else or be connected. So it has this quality of being a kind of guerrilla war that's going on under the surface. And you'd be connected. So as an ex-rider who was trying to support these strikes, I'd sometimes find out a couple of weeks after something had happened that, oh, there's been this big fight in this like area of London that you've never been to before, that you didn't know there was anyone organising there. So it's constant little fights all the time. And I think it's easy to not understand from the outside just like how rapid fire a lot of this was, just days of strike action here and there all over the country.
And I remember when I first met you, because I had a little bit more of political awareness, and I saw what was happening from a political view. And so I did my research and I found an article written by you. So when I saw you on the group, I said, whoa, I should connect with that guy. And then I remember texting you and say, oh, you wrote a really nice article. I really like your work. And then we got connected. And from there, I just found that on our WhatsApp group, there were many, many of you who were people who did that before, you know, like who could guide us through this difficult time right now and give us advice on what to do. And
I think this is the most important thing, is that as we go through all this history, right, we're seeing the same patterns and difficulties over and over again. So we've seen like explosion, riders really angry about some negative change. I mean, in 2019, the changes that people were striking about at that point were like the deprioritization of cyclists, which is leading to this process that we've talked about before of the transition from like, kind of like the white British student being the archetypal worker to it just being migrant moped workers primarily. So like that transition is going on. They're introducing free login everywhere, so there's no more guaranteed shift hours for people, and they're cutting minimum order values all over the place. So there's this constant downward drive on wages. Like all of this is really familiar with us, and we've seen the explosive response. But it's that transition to organisation that no one has achieved yet sustainably, right? That the unions that we've been talking about, the IWW, the IWGB, they have for times built like strong memberships in certain places. Like when I was in Brighton, we had, 20, 30 IWGB members who were the core of the organised group. But in the long term, they kind of like fade as people turn over and leave the job and move on. So this history for me is like a history of us running into the same problems over and over again. But if we've run into them and we've tried different ways around them, we can try and collectively work out what like some of the steps are to go through those problems and out the other side. Like how do we build a durable form of organisation that can not just strike once and strike really big, but strike over and over again, enough to actually build up a relationship of power with the platforms where they have to give in to us, which is, it's going to take a lot of work, right? But when we look back, anything else hasn't worked. So that's the challenge left open to us now. All right, cool. Where should we go?
I think we got 12 minutes left, right?
Oh, no. Okay, yeah. So we'll have Laura doing that. I'll do the Dalston bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe we'll finish with the NFP plug. Okay, go to the Dalston bit. So migration has been a constant issue in all the strikes we've spoken about so far. Increasingly over time, delivery work has become de facto migrant work. People do the job and accept the low wages and the high risks, in part because they're shut out of all the other parts of the labour market. They have no other options. Maybe they have poor English language skills, maybe they're victims of racial discrimination, maybe they have no official right to work. Whatever the reason, lots of migrants end up doing the vast majority of deliveries. In London, it's probably upwards of 80% of riders who are migrants. So it's not surprising then that that shows up in the struggles. In Dalston, a 2022 policing and immigration operation supported by Hackney Council turned into a confrontation between the local community and the state. Alex Marshall, president of the Independent Workers of Great Britain, the IWGB, an ex-courier himself, was there on the ground. Okay, then we'll go to the conclusion then. And let's do that for the last time.
Oh, that's amazing.
Ooh, we've timed it well.
Oh, we did really good with the timing.
So, that's the history then. It's a potted history of a load of strikes in a load of places that have happened often without central organisation, that have spread very fast and then burnt out. And we can look back at that and say that despite all the effort and despite all the passion and commitment shown by those riders, wages have still gone down, right? So none of them have won. They might have won in the local areas in short term, but they've never won on a big scale.
I would say there's even a difference. You said that after the strikes, it's they increasing the fees for a short period of time. I think they changed the tactics now.
They don't do that anymore.
They're decreasing. They're definitely decreasing. So we had a lot of people saying, "Oh, this is not changing anything. It's just making things worse."
Yeah, and people getting demoralised because they will go out on strike. They expect like a couple of strikes are going to win something, but it doesn't. And then suddenly, what do you do next, right?
Right. Yes. And also, let's say, as a self-criticism, I would say that because the demographic right now, especially among the Brazilians, is that most of them are far-right supporters, and they don't really understand anything about strikes or collective bargain, right? So I think that one thing to win is to first spread the class conscience among us.
Yeah.
Because we start from the end.
Yeah.
We need to first build the idea that we're fighting against these companies, and they're trying to make our lives harder so they can make more money to buy nice jets and nice house, while putting you in a situation where you had to work and lose your family.
Yeah, I mean it's this kind of crazy thing where you've got a workforce where people are constantly almost going on strike, like probably the most strike-prone workforce I can think of, where there's this constant like level of struggle, but it's very rarely being thought of politically by the participants. And it's that when you're engaging with it, you're quite often like, this is really, really exciting because like, people are being militant, they're shutting shit down. Their picket lines, they're not a joke, right? You're like, you don't cross the picket lines. They're stopping people working. They are really enforcing their leverage and making sure that work stops when they're on strike. But because there's not often these like opportunities for long-term sharing ideas and developing organization, that doesn't necessarily lead to political development in the same way it might with other groups of workers. So if you, for instance, talk to teachers or nurses or other people who've been on strike a lot, their involvement in those strikes might fundamentally change their political outlook. But I'm not sure that happens to the same degree with delivery riders, quite often because they're moving so quickly and that, there's limited opportunity for that dialogue that might prompt people to think about class and to think about why are the platforms exploiting us, right? Why are they treating us like this? Instead, it's that culture of like class consciousness, like you said, that's not quite breaking through yet. So we need to think about how we can create those opportunities. And you talked about Gallo as probably one of the only people who's really succeeded in doing that, right?
Yes, and there's a lot of what they call in Brazil as web communists, like trying to undermine it. Web communists.
Oh, web communists.
Yeah, that people that really got a big amount of followers that teaching people class conscious. But talking about the Brazilian community, and I would say the fact that they participated on the strikes and
Yeah.
they were so passionate about it gives me hope that they are not far right. They just fell for the sweet talk, you know. I think that there's hope to really catch their attention and show them that they are fighting against the wrong enemy, you know.
It could be a very superficial ideology, right? Like a lot of people, you know, unless you really think about politics, which a lot of people don't do a lot of the time, like you might just go with ideas that seem to make sense in your immediate context and not really reflect on them, or have very contradictory ideas where you like believe in strikes but then also might believe some sub element of whatever Bolsonaro's, you know, going on about at the time. So those contradictions can be and should be worked out, right? And when we work them out, we should be able to show people that, you know, actually your interests, you really don't lie with the billionaires who are like funding this mega church or whoever it is that's convincing you to not support other workers, but they actually lie with people like you. And you can see that because, you know, when you go on strike, who shows up to support you, who is on your side and who's not, right? The police, the state, the bosses, they're not on your side. But actually, you know, it's other workers who are turning out to support you. It's other workers who are coming out on your picket lines. It's, you know, trade unionists and those kind of people who want you to win, you know? So when it comes down to it, we can prove through kind of action which side people are on.
Lead by example, right?
Well, yeah, it reminds me of this thing of, so, I mean, it's a bit of digression, but in the history of the Bolshevik Party, there's this period I always reference, the Russian Social Democratic Party, where they've been trying to do political education at this point in the 1890s by meeting up with people and reading books, and they've been trying to like educate the working class into class consciousness through meeting up and reading books. And it doesn't really work, because what ends up happening is they'll recruit a few workers, they'll read a load of books with them, and then those workers will be kind of like distanced from the people they used to work with, and they'll think of themselves as like very different, and they'll take on a different cultural attitude. So rather than educating the entire working class, what they're doing is like elevating certain people to kind of a more middle class position, and then they're completely useless as organisers, and they have to start all over again, right? So then there's a process within the Russian Social Democratic movement of like, how do we deal with that? And people start coming up with this idea of like, we've just got to get really stuck into strikes, and we can, through practically showing that fighting for a higher wage that means like survival for you and your family leads you into conflict with the Tsar, leads you into conflict with the state, and leads you into conflict with the bosses. We can demonstrate, you know, our political ideas in practice. And that's kind of like how I think about a lot of these delivery strikes, and like the role of politicizing them, and how, as you know, as communists, you can come into a struggle like this with a clear idea, is that, you know, communists don't think that every strike is going to win, right? That's not how it works. I mean, if it did, why would any of us be paying any attention to delivery strike after the history we've just gone through? But we think that strikes are an important kind of subjective process, an important experience that can help people grow and identify what they're fighting for and who they're fighting against. And we kind of get stuck in that way, in the hope that we can build working class self-organisation and support people to take on bigger political struggles through those initial economic struggles, becoming, you know, increasingly like, if, you know, just look at the near future of Britain. If we all want to fight for higher real wages, at a certain point we're going to have to drive down profits, right? And that is going to be a titanic political and economic struggle at the same time. You can't just do that. You can't just go on strike for that and hope that you win because you're really powerful. You'll also need to fight the state, and you'll need to make political demands that go alongside it. So for me, that's how we drive at these bad ideas and help push people towards a more accurate understanding of their situation.
And now we have a huge challenge because Brazil is very polarized.
Yeah.
You can just see these on the WhatsApp groups where there's a lot of people saying that, well, you guys are just lazy trying to strike because if you work 14 hours a day, there's no way that you're going to be into poverty. They just normalizing the thing, you know. They just putting the blame on other people, saying like, well, we don't want any change. Like, it's good the way it is, but it's not. They're just like, I just think like when you preach that neoliberal idea, it's really hard for you to turn back and say, look, I was wrong.
Well, but also it's crazy how much of, you know, we talk about material interests, right, as if it should be obvious, you know, the working class has a particular material interest, but actually like people have cultures of what they find acceptable and what they find necessary that completely condition. Like if someone asked me to work a 14-hour day, there's no chance. I like literally couldn't do it. I did some 14-hour shifts when I was an 18-year-old in like hospitality. I couldn't do it today. I'm too old and broken. And yet these guys are doing it, and they like think it's normal, right? And if they didn't think it's normal, then they would potentially like have a very different political understanding. So it's about changing the culture and raising expectations as well. That actually, like, people shouldn't have to work 14 hours a day in the 6th richest country in the world just to get by. That's crazy.
It is indeed.
That's us. We've got 1 minute. Okay, let me do the plug, and then we'll be out of here. Okay. All right, that's it for episode 2 of Beating the Platforms. Next time, we're going to move on to the latest round of strikes and understand what the balance of forces between bosses and workers looks like right now. That's also going to involve a longer chat about key issues like migration, as well as a reflection on Yuli's recent experiences as an organiser and mine as a supporter. Before we go, I just want to remind you this podcast is produced by Notes from Below, a journal of worker writing. It costs time and money to bring you these episodes, and we don't have any billionaire funders, so we rely on you to make it happen. If you can, please support us for just £3 a month at notesfrombelow.org/supporter. Whilst you're there, you could also splash out and get yourself a print subscription and receive 3 copies a year of the journal for just £5 a month. Even better, every single print subscriber also funds free copies for us to distribute on picket lines and in working class communities. If that's not an option, you'll always be able to read everything we've ever published for free right there on the website. As of right now, there are over 400 articles for you to choose from. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
Wow, that was perfect.
That was good, wasn't it?
Yes.
Oh.
That was the timing couldn't be better, yeah?
Yeah,
You're very
time
good
to
on
the minute.
timing, yeah?
Yeah, very good.
God damn it, I was
Bang on the
impressed.
dot.
Oh,
This was very good podcast.
thanks so much. Yeah, we have to do
Stopping the
all the
recording.
editing now.
Now it starts.
Recording.
I'm editing on Premiere Pro. I asked my friends, like, would you edit on Premiere? They said probably Audition is better, but like no one knows how to use Audition.
Yeah, Audition. I can use Audition. But
Just
yeah,
Premiere Pro for yourself.
Yeah.
It is a lot easier. 100%. I just wish the screen was bigger for audio. Because you know, like when you stretch the oh, it's so much enough. But it's getting better and better.
Ah, good pen. Thank you so much.
So okay, cool. So we're not.
So you're going to WeTransfer us?
We transfer the audio files.
Yes, please.
The video files. That's what we need. Actually, it's just one video file. Yes, please take pictures. Promo, like videos of yourselves.
Yeah.
Everything you want.
No, I did one. I did one myself.
I'm
Man, this is beautiful.
too self-conscious.
I'm sure there will be some of my friends on you.
Right, thank you so much, man. Oh, I need to put my
I
glasses.
just live a 3-year-old down the road.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'll be seeing you here quite often.
Yes. Yeah, my neighbor, he wants to do one.
If you're happy, like it seems as though you lot are cool. You don't need much help. Let's reduce the price. Yeah, let's reduce the price and
Cool. Great.
get everything done. One thing I'll ask,
Yeah?
please, no shame in the game. We're trying our very best to like get discovered on Google.
Yeah.
Oh.
Do a positive review.
Yeah. So I think you could basically just tap your phone or take a picture of this.
Right.
I love how QR codes work.
My dad is a big QR code guy.
So you went to Brighton University.
No, I was Warwick, then Sussex, then University of West London. Now I work at them. I've been to every university at this point. Yeah, I spent an outrageous amount of my time as a student, and then just carried on and became a lecturer.
doctorate then?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I got
Masters, doctorate. I think you must have got 2 masters.
No, I've only got 1 master's and 1 PhD. Then I did my postdoc at Oxford, and then now I'm at Essex.
I did about the technical parts. Cameras, lighting.
No, I've just made it 5-star. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, Cam, really appreciate it. I'll come back to you on price. It'll be good to work it out. Cool. Do you need any more photos? Are you sorted?
Amazing. Right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot better. Sorry.
It's 2 hours, so it's gonna be like at least another 6 hours listening to everything.
Listen, make notes first.
Yes.
Timestamp the notes. Then go back. Do the changes. Then re-listen.
Oh gosh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, that's all good. Yeah. So 2 hours may become 8.
But I always listen double speed.
That's a good
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So-
Thanks for the advice. Yeah, I had a woman. She approached me. She wants to record a tournament of football.
Yeah.
But she said you had to record all the match, 6 minutes each match. So the whole event might be 6 hours. And I said, what? Me recording like match, and then you have to stop.
What, so you have to
45
video
minutes
6-minute matches over 6 hours?
over 6 hours, and then I will have to go through all the matches to get the best moments to make cuts. I said, no, I'm not doing. Thank you so much.
Would you like to pay me £500,000?
Yeah,